So welcome to the next module. We're going to be looking at teams and groups and organizations. So again, what does organizational psychology and science tell us about how groups form, what groups are, what's the difference between groups and versus teams? And this does become a little bit muddy, mainly because a lot of organizations have focused on defining different types of teams and trying to define the difference between teams and groups. And therefore, social psychology has also been having to try to come up to terms with how to define these as far as what the research shows. So we're mainly going to focus on what we know about human interaction and human behavior, how we form groups and teams, and what can organizations do to try to ensure if teams are an appropriate response and an appropriate work style for that organization, how to make sure they get high performing teams. So as always, we're going to start with some definitions, discussions, and then kind of start looking at some of the overarching theories that are often applied to organizational settings when we're trying to kind of figure out teams and groups. And this is probably a good point for me to remind you that when we're looking at these theories and these models, what we're doing is we're trying to take very complex concepts like teams and just think of any particular team, a sports team, for instance. Each individual has their own skills, their own attitudes, their own personality, and their own motivations for being a part of that team. So how do you actually focus that team into high performance? And how do you manage and basically positively manage all of those differences? So when we're talking about trying to anticipate which teams are going to succeed and which aren't, it is a very difficult thing. If there was a guaranteed formula, then almost every single sports team, especially in professional sports, would always be just barely winning against each other. They'd all be very, very similar. But what happens is again, that winning combination of having just the right combination takes a lot of work and honestly somewhat some luck. So because of the complexity, that's one of the reasons we try to conceptualize these with models and theories that help us kind of think through this process of what is some of the things that we can do that are most likely to work. So again, before we get into the actual definitions of groups and teams, I want to remind you that we're looking at this and always within the confines of the big picture. That open systems model where we're looking at what's outside the organization, what does the organization need to survive, what does it do in the organization, what does it produce, and what kind of feedback does it get. But when we're looking at the inside of the organization, we've also got these three broad levels: organizational processes, group processes, and individual processes. And all of them interact with each other. The organizational processes impact both the group and the individual. The individual impacts groups and the organization. And groups impact both the organizational processes, both back and forth, and the individual processes. So when we're talking about teamwork in groups, we're kind of at that mid-level. We're not at the full organizational process, how an organization is actually structured, nor are we still looking at just the individual process. But we're looking at something kind of unique that's a combination of both. How, when we put together a group of individuals, that group then functions within the organization itself. So let's start with our definition of a group. Groups are defined as two or more interacting individuals. And by social psychology, any group of two or more is considered a group, but I would make a distinction that I generally think of groups as three or more people. And the reason for that is that when we look at only two people as a group, there's a little bit of a difference in how we actually can predict behavior. It's often referred to as dyads in the science and the research in social psychology. So though the official definition of group is two or more individuals, I would say if you're working with only two, make sure you're looking at research that looks at dyads because there are some differences. They maintain a stable pattern of relationships. So this group of two or more individuals do interact, and they tend to have a stable pattern of behavior. So for example, think of South Park. The kids get together at the bus. That's where they first get together. They then go to classes when they share the classes and they're in the same classroom together. And then often when they're done, not only do they take the same bus back to their bus stop, they often spend their spare time with each other. Again, if you think of various sitcoms, what we're looking at again is a stable pattern, that there is a predictable exchange of interactions between them. Groups also tend to share a common goal or purpose. So again, if we're talking about a group, we often are also thinking of it in organizational terms. So if a group of people that have a shared pattern, they also probably have some form of goal or purpose to their interactions. Now, that purpose may simply be to fulfill a social need, but it's still going to be there. They do perceive themselves as being a group with a sense of belonging. So they basically do view themselves, and this is an important part of groups. If you don't think you're a part of a group, in other words, if there's 5 people you work with, you meet them regularly, you share a common goal, build cars for instance, but you don't perceive any sense of belonging to that group, you wouldn't even acknowledge them outside of the workplace setting, we're probably not looking at a group. So groups do contain a social component, a sense of belonging, an in-group and an out-group. For again, back to South Park, the 4 kids basically would clearly identify, even if they don't necessarily like each other that much, that they are a group of friends, that they have a shared sense of belonging. And finally, they exert influence over one another. In other words, if someone is wanting to do something, people are more likely within their group to listen to that request. And that gets to that idea of sense of belonging. So these are the factors that we define as a group. And when we're talking about groups, again, we're talking about basically functional work groups and organizations. We're also talking about functioning social groups and how we're predicting their behavior. If we're missing any of these components, we're probably not necessarily going to see the group processes that we're talking about in this chapter. And it's going to be less likely we could predict behavior, because in order to predict behavior, to increase behavior, to basically make sure people are performing well and enjoying their work, and if we're doing a group intervention, we need to make sure that we are dealing with an actual group to begin with. Is it 2 or more individuals? Is there a stable pattern of relationships? Do they share goals? Do they perceive themselves as being a part of the group? And do they exert influence over one another? So when we look at teams, we also are basically thinking about a slightly different definition. A team is defined as a mutually dependent collection of individuals. So it's a group of individuals, 2 or more. They're mutually dependent. So at this point, in order for them to get to their goals, they need to work with each other. So they work together towards a common goal, and who share responsibility for specific outcomes for the organization. So really, when we're talking about a team, the additional requirement of being a team is that it's identifying the team members by both outside and inside the team, but also that mutually dependent set of actions towards a goal. So all groups will have some form of goal. Teams will usually have a goal that is required by their organization, and it's a goal that individually they could not accomplish together. So you can kind of start to see the definition and how these two things might vary. You may have both groups and teams within an organization. If there's 5 people that are working on an assembly line, identify with each other very much, like each other, influence each other, work together regularly, and have a common goal, building cars, but they don't necessarily need to work dependently on each other. In other words, when they're working together, if one of them's missing, someone else will just step into that role. For a team to exist, basically you have to have a broad set of skills, and all of those skills need to be brought to bear on the project. So think about maybe producing a new product. You need someone from engineering, can we make it? You need someone from kind of finance, how much will it cost? You need someone from marketing, how can we make sure people want it? And if any of those people are not there, the project can't be completed. So usually that's when we're talking about a team. So that again, that mutually dependent, the skills have to be combined to achieve the goal. That's what makes a team over a group. So what is a team or group? Historically, there have been major distinctions being made between teams and groups. Social psychologists tend to study groups in the lab. Organizational psychologists tend to study teams in organizational settings. So that's one of the first things, is that when we look at group research, we're probably looking at research that's more general. That doesn't mean that it's not useful, but it usually is more looking at social interactions and people that are quickly thrown together to have to form a group. Organizational psychologists and research that looks at teams is typically looking at pre-existing teams and how they perform in an organizational setting. So basically, there's too much in common to make any strong, meaningful distinctions between them, and teams and groups have often been used interchangeably in the research. In 2007, Frank Landy did a major meta-analysis looking at various articles and found that the definitions being used for groups and teams often really were very similar. So for the purpose of this class, think of organizational groups and teams as being fairly similar, but like I said, I would say that there is one distinction, and it isn't made by everyone. But if you're really talking about a team, there's going to be that mutually dependent series of actions where everyone in the team needs to be functioning and performing in order for the teams to succeed. While I would say that if we're talking about just a group, we have very similarities there, a lot of similarities in the definition, but that mutual dependency is probably not going to be there. So when we look at the research on team dynamics, it's the social psychology field focusing on the nature of groups, and there's an enormous amount of research that's been done in this area. The factors governing their formation and development, the elements of their structure, and the interrelationships within individuals, other groups, and organizations. And we're going to talk about all of these in turn. We're going to talk about how do teams form and how do groups form and how do they develop. We're then going to talk about, once you have a team that is developed, what are the elements of their structure? In other words, what components need to be there for success? And then we're really going to talk about how do you actually manage the individual differences within the team and how the team interacts outside of the team. And we're also going to look at some of the pitfalls that social psychology has found when we're looking at teams. There are great advantages to teams and groups. In fact, many organizations have been focusing on trying to build better teams and turning their workforce over towards more of a team orientation than a group or individual orientation where possible. But one of the downsides of this is, again, that we have a tendency to both basically do what's called out-grouping and in-grouping. We tend to be more favorable and more understanding of our in-groups, the groups that we belong to, and we're more likely to see the individual differences or challenges within a group that we're a member of. When we're looking at a group that we're not a member of, we tend to look at it as an out-group. We tend to look at it as basically we have less understanding of what their challenges are and more likely to make attributions towards the group itself. And if you'll think way back when we were talking about fundamental attribution error, the fact that we're very likely to recognize the situation's impact on our own negative behaviors, but make an attribution that negative behaviors in others is because of who they are, an internal attribution. The same effect happens with groups. We tend to be more likely to see the external influences on a group's behavior, the understanding the situation may have constrained our behavior as a group, and we're less likely to see that when we look at outgroups. We're more likely to assume that if a group is failing, it's not because of the environment they're in, it's because they're not a very good group. So we need to watch for that as well, especially when we have multiple teams and groups, that we are building up that cohesiveness within, that we're also not fostering a relationship that involves kind of groups disliking each other. So based on that, let's talk about the formation first. So how groups form and develop, and we're going to cover two major theories here. So probably the most famous theory is the five-stage model suggested by Tuckman in 1965. It theorizes that groups and teams develop in five distinct stages: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. Now, like a lot of theories, there's a fair amount of support for this. A lot of groups go through this process. When you are first making a group or team, you're going to be in the forming phase. And then that forming phase is going to transition generally fairly quickly to the storming phase, where everyone's figuring out their role and how the team's going to work. Once that's done, we move to the norming phase, and norming basically means the organization or the group or the team is figuring out what are the rules and what are the expectations, and finally we get to performing. Performing is where we want to be. So organizations, using this model as a way to think about this, want to basically create an environment and create the tools to allow new groups and teams to go fairly quickly through the forming, storming, and norming phase to get to the performing phase. The fifth stage is basically when groups basically are broken apart or no longer function together. And that's the adjoining phase. So we're going to talk about each one of these five phases. Now, I mentioned that this theory works in most cases. Generally speaking, what we find is that indeed, when we're trying to create a team, we want to get to norming and performing as quickly as possible, and that it's a linear model, that basically we are moving from one phase to the next. And this is supported in many groups and teams. However, it is not a perfect model. There are some teams that jump right into performing. There are some teams that skip storming and norming. And there are some groups that basically never get to performing. So it is often linear, but not always linear. But it is a good way to conceptualize how teams basically get from their initial creation to actually being highly productive. So let's talk about each one of these in turn. The forming stage, high dependence on leader for guidance and direction. And that leader may be a part of the group. It may be an external leader that has formed the group or team. Individual roles and responsibilities are very unclear at this phase. Leaders must be prepared to answer lots of questions about the team's purpose, objectives, and external relationships, and processes are often ignored. Members test the tolerance of the system and the leaders. So one of the ways that an organization can try to make this more comfortable and quickly functioning is to provide a lot of this up front. What are the roles? Why is each person on this team? What are their objectives? What is the objective of the team? So basically, if you throw together a team with not clear roles and responsibilities, the purpose or the objectives are not necessarily clear, and also even if the team is going to interact with other teams is not 100% clear, you're going to have a longer term in the forming phase. The way you can get through this phase quicker is, again, to be able to provide clear information on what individual roles are, what their responsibilities are, what the actual objective and purpose is, and if there's any other teams that are going to be contacted, how that process would work, and what the expectations there are as well. The next phase is storming. Decisions don't come easily within this group. Team members vie for position as they attempt to establish themselves in relations to other team members and the leader, who might receive challenges from other team members. Cliques and factions may form depending on the size of the team, and there may be some power struggles. The team needs to focus on its goals to avoid becoming distracted by relationships and emotional issues. So storming is really more of a social factor. At this point, it's when people are trying to figure out not only their roles, but also who's in charge and who's making the decisions. Again, if this has been well defined in the previous phase, storming may happen quicker. But storming is always going to be a part of this. And that's another thing about this theory. This theory is a linear theory. In other words, once you get through storming, the assumption is that you would not return to storming. The reality is that a lot of times when there's a shock to the system, if a new objective or a new deadline comes down the line, if there's a major issue with a decision that was made, often an organization may move backwards, an organization, and by organization I mean a group or team, from like the performing phase back to the storming phase. But the storming phase is a necessary phase. It's allowing the individuals to figure out how are we actually going to work and what are the social boundaries of this organization or this group. So norming means that we've moved past that storming, we've understood, we've figured out what we've formed, we've stormed, and now we're basically just creating, and this can be officially created through documents and memos, it may be just an unofficial understanding, but everyone now understands their roles and responsibilities, they're clear and accepted. Decisions are being made by group agreement, or at least everyone understands how decisions are being made. We see a strong increase in commitment and unity. This is usually when that in-grouping happens. People start to enjoy being a part of the group, they understand the group, and they're proud of being a part of the group. The team may start to engage in fun and social activities. We'd also expect to see more social interactions before and after meetings. The team discusses and develops its processes and work styles, and there's a general respect for the leader, and some of the leadership is shared by the team. This is all of the things that we'd expect in the norming phase. Now, again, an organization can take a little bit of active role in this process by making sure that these things are happening, that making sure that the team is not just focused on the task, that there is some social activities, make sure that there's actually a strong commitment that's growing to the group, and also make sure that respect is happening through the leadership decision making. And the goal of all three of these phases is to get to performing. The team is more strategically aware. The team clearly knows why it's doing what it's doing. The team has a shared vision and is able to stand on its own feet with no interference or participation from the outside leadership. The team has a high degree of autonomy. Disagreements occur, but now are resolved within the team positively, and necessary changes to process and structure are made by the team. Often in this phase, this part is also not requiring external intervention anymore. The previous three phases, sometimes outside leadership, the people that form the team that are expecting the team to perform, may need to take a hand in kind of resolving these issues. When we're in the performing phase, the team should be basically self-sufficient. The team members may ask for assistance from leaders and leadership only with personal and interpersonal development, but for the most part, those are small issues at this point. And this is when we'd also expect to see the team to actually start being, as far as an organization is concerned, performing well, creating new ideas, basically achieving the tasks, the goals, and the objectives that were set. Now, the final phase is the adjourning phase. This is for teams that then are going to be broken up afterwards. So sometimes teams are permanent teams. Sometimes teams are specific. So in my own work role, I have a couple of permanent teams. So for example, the North American Assessment Branch, that's about 22 people that I am constantly working with. I have meetings with regularly, and I definitely believe that that is one of my in-groups. And it's mainly made up of other PhD, industrial organizational psychologists that basically do the work that I do as well. However, for each individual client, I will have a much smaller team, usually somewhere between 3 and 5 people that are working on that particular client. Some of those clients we might have a contract with for 3 years. That means that team will work for 3 years. And if we don't get a renewal on the contract, we adjourn. Sometimes we get contracts with an organization. I've got one, for instance, that's less than 2 months. So from startup to finish of the job, it'll be about 2 months. I'm working with 5 people, and at the end of that, we will no longer be working together on this project. So adjourning is often a natural extension of the process, and it should be attended to as well by organizations. So it's the breaking up the group. Task may not be completed successfully, so the group may fail, or the task has been completed, and there's no longer a need for this particular group. From an organizational perspective, recognition and sensitivity of people's vulnerabilities in the 5th stage is helpful, particularly if members of the group have been closely bonded and feel a sense of insecurity or a threat from this change. So we need to recognize that if people have bonded with the group, thought of the group as a part of their identity, and have a strong social connection with the group, then once the group ends, the organization needs to at least be aware of that and helpful in the process, maybe encouraging continuing membership in a larger group. So feelings of insecurity would be natural for people who prefer steadiness and routines. So again, we just want to be aware that because the process of creating a high-performing team does also involve creating a social condition where we have a strong feeling of commitment and positive feelings towards the group, and we're getting some of our social cues and our social interactions from the group. When the group adjourns, we need to be aware of that as well. So this was our first theory. This is Tuckman's 5-stage model. We'll be talking about another theory that is another way to conceptualize how groups form. We'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the next model, and then we'll continue talking about what we can do to maximize groups and teams and organizations. So I'll talk to you in our next module.